Hi guys, I just want to do a quick video of the new features, changes and bug fixes in the latest version of Construction Line, version 0.9.3. A few people have asked for videos in the past showing new features and changes, so I wanted to do it for this one, and I'll try and do it for subsequent ones, especially those with bigger changes in them. So the first feature is to do with snapping, and I've added two new snap directions. You could always snap to X, Y and Z directions, and now we've got two more. We can snap perpendicular, which will show in pink, and that works across faces, which is really useful if you are working with rotated geometry and you want to cut into that geometry. You can now do that with perpendicular as well as the other axes. This works off of any edge. It doesn't have to be attached to 3D geometry. It can be just an edge on its own or a guide edge, and you can find that perpendicular direction. The other direction, if I delete the cube, I'll draw a quick guide edge here. The other direction is an edge extension, so finding the direction that an existing edge or guide is going in, and you can snap to that, and that will be in purple. So when I find that, it will automatically snap in that direction, and then you can type any number of courses you would normally be able to do, and you just simply extend that geometry edge or guide edge forward. So these are two really useful features, especially for CAD work. I use these all the time in other packages, so I'm really pleased to be able to bring it into construction lines. The next one is more of a change than a feature, and that's to do with numeric input. So there's been a bit of discussion about this in the forum. Thanks to anyone who's been involved in that, especially Mario. Thanks for all the input there. Previously, when entering a number, you would simply drag out either geometry or a guide and then start typing in. However, if you use the number pad, that might change the camera orientation, which isn't terribly useful. It's a little bit clumsy in the way it worked. So I've changed this now, that when you want to enter numeric input or some expression, you will press the enter key, which will enter a new mode now, an input mode, and you'll see that because it says up here type in number or expression, and then you can simply type in your number either on the number pad or the number row on the top of your keyboard. They will both work in the same way. I'll type 2 here and hit enter again, and that will work to produce the new geometry or the new guide. And it's a much cleaner, much clearer way of working, I think. The next feature is again something that's been asked a few times in the past, and that's the ability to use construction line guide edges outside of construction lines. You could always use the construction points, but the guide edges, because they're specific to construction lines, you couldn't use them outside in normal Blender. So I've now added this ability to shift and click and select a guide edge, which will turn it to an orange color. You can select multiple edges, and you can deselect in just the same way. And if you right click and select the new item, which is convert to geometry, or press the K key, that will convert that guide edge into a real piece of geometry so that you can use it outside in Blender. So you could snap to that with Blender's own snap tools, or just use that as a piece of normal geometry. So that's a new feature. I've also added a preference. I'll show you the preference here. We go to Edit Preferences. We go to Construction Lines and a new Override Unit Length Scale. This is very specific to a type of working in Blender, I think, for very small scale work or for working with things like 3D printing. A few users have asked me to include this for their own work. And all this does is overrides the unit length scale here with a unit scale of your own choosing. So anything you type in here, you might type 0.001, 001, and that will be the scale that is used now instead of this length scale. But measurements will still work with the length unit. I won't demonstrate this, it takes a little while to set up to demonstrate it, but if you work in this way you'll know what this means and it will be useful to you in 3D printing or working at a very small scale. So that's a new preference that's been added to overcome this issue here. Also in the preferences I've added a scale for guide points. So at the moment the default, which actually is a new default scale at 0.2, I felt the previous points were just a touch too big, so I've reduced those. But if we take them, say, to a scale of 1, you'll see that any new guide point is added at that much larger scale. And you can also change all existing points. If you right click for the context menu and select Scale All, that will scale everything up to that new scale. And then if I wish to either go back or set a new scale, I might set that to 0.1 for a much smaller guide point. I can right click, Scale All, and that will take all of the points down to a much smaller scale. So that's useful if you're working in very large or very small scales. You can adjust the guide points so that they don't get in your way, or you can see them from a further distance. And as I say, I've changed the default now to a slightly smaller size, which I think works better. Another new feature is for 3D mouse users. So 3D mouse events are now passed back through to Blender. So you can navigate in your scene in the viewport with a 3D mouse now, which you couldn't do before. I don't have a 3D mouse myself, so I can't show you this, but a few people that have tested this for me and they say that it does work, so you can use that now. The next point, it's a small thing, but I think it makes quite a big difference, is that the snapping to axes is now a lot softer. Before it was a little too strong, and now that I've added things like perpendicular directions, it was snapping way too hard. It was very hard to get between snap points, so that has been reduced, and you can have a bit more control over that. The last 2 points I want to mention as new features are actually from previous versions, but a few people have asked about how exactly they work, so I'll quickly demonstrate them now. And the first one is being able to divide a guide line or guide edge into equal parts. So if you hold down Control whilst you drag your guide edge out and use the mouse wheel, actually if I zoom in a bit you'll be able to see a bit clearer, you'll see these orange dots, and they show that the guide edge will be divided perfectly between at those particular points, and you can reduce or increase the number either by holding control and using the mouse wheel or using the up and down arrow on your keyboard. And now if I click to finish the guide, you'll see that this guide edge has been divided perfectly into either 4 sections or 3 guide points, depending on how you look at it. In a similar way, another feature from previously is if I start to draw an arc or a circle, I'll drag this out, you can use that same technique of holding control down and rolling the mouse wheel to increase the segments. If you look up in the left hand corner, this is just controlling the number of segments using control on the mouse wheel. You can still use just the arrow key, but I think it's probably easier to use the mouse wheel if you have one holding control. So that was from previous versions, but I wanted to show it there. Moving on to bug fixes. I think the main one this time around has been for Apple Mac users, those who have slightly older Apple Macs. They were having issues with guide edges displaying either when you're dragging out or through those fixed actual guide edges that have been set, and they weren't displaying. And this was an issue with OpenGL shaders and the way they work on the version of OpenGL on Macs. But I've updated the shader now and this works correctly, so dashed lines will show. It would always show solid lines, but it was just the dashed lines that were a bit of an issue, so they will show now. That's fixed. Another bug was to do with calling undo multiple times. So if you kept pressing Ctrl Z to undo, this could take you outside of the construction lines context, or the context that construction lines works in, so that would sometimes cause a crash. That's been fixed and limited. If I add in a cube here, this was an issue with the way scaling was working. So if I measure off the cube, which we know is 2 meters by 2 meters by 2 meters, I'll change this unit scale back to 1. And if I measure this cube, we're at 2 meters by 2 meters by 2 meters. Now, changing to millimeters would cause that measurement to change as well. It will be scale, but that's fixed now. So we are now on 2 meters again, so that works correctly now. There was also an issue with in metric mode when you're entering values. Sometimes you could enter a non-numeric value if it was one that you might use in imperial. It was passing through imperial non-numeric values like quotes, double quotes and single quotes, so it would try to evaluate that, and that would cause a crash. That has been fixed. Now also mouse clicks outside of the viewport, so clicking over to the outliner or preferences, that would create geometry or a guide point outside of this viewport. So you'd click over here and it would actually set a new point, which is not how it should work. So that has been handled correctly now. You can still change preferences. It will register those clicks, but it won't create any geometry or guides behind what you're trying to do. The outliner, it is still locked, so it won't register any clicks because of the way that construction lines works when you are working in edit, between modes, edit and object mode. You can hold your cursor over any object and hit the tab key, which will change the mode. If you were to select a new object, this could mess this up during an operation, so I've made sure that that doesn't happen. So you won't be able to change objects, but you can change preferences. There was a minor bug in the preferences where if you go to edit preferences and I'm going to take this off now, color of guidelines, these color values could grow above 1 and below 0, which is incorrect, so they're now limited properly. There's also been numerous stability and performance improvements. There's been a lot of recoding, mainly to allow for new things that are coming up in the future, but also for various fixes and the way that internally this works now. So that should be a lot smoother and things are working better. And talking about things coming in the future, there are 3 or 4 things that I am aiming for the next release, 3 or 4 big developments along with any of the sort of minor things I have on my list. And the first of those is about rotation. So there's been a couple of add-ons that do a similar thing, one of which that has been discontinued now. So I do want to have this as part of construction lines, and it's how some other 3D software works, like SketchUp. And I like this way of working. I think it's very intuitive when it comes to rotation. And we look at the way that Blender normally works. You hit the R key to rotate. It rotates around the origin that's been set, or of course you can set it to rotate around the 3D cursor, or you can reset the origin to somewhere else. But I like the way of working, and I think quite a few other people do as well if they've come from SketchUp or other software, where you can select an initial point which will now be your origin of rotation, and then you select your second point which defines the plane of rotation that you're working in. Obviously if I click here it's just going to set a point, but that would be the point now that you would be rotating around, either up and down or side to side. And I find that a great way of handling rotations, so I want to include that in the next version 0.9.4. and along with that I want to allow you to be able to move guide edges, so you should be able to drag them around up and down geometry, and that would also include being able to rotate guide edges around. I find that I use this a lot in other software, this ability to click a start point, an end point, and then rotate a guide around or an edge around or some other geometry around. I find that a very powerful way of being able to work. I use that a lot, so I want to include that. Another thing that I really want to add in the new version, I've started developing this and it does seem to be working, it needs work, but it's getting there, is this ability to cut into faces off of an edge, away from an edge. I mean, so let's go into top view. If I were to create a rectangle in edit mode on this face, it would split this face, and I can now use either of these two for new faces to extrude them or extrude them out in, etc. And this is great for cutting holes into geometry, and I use this again all the time, and I think anyone who uses SketchUp and some other software, we use that a lot. It's a very powerful way of quickly cutting into geometry. However, at the moment, I'll undo these, if you draw in the center or away from an edge, it won't divide at the moment. It doesn't cut into that face. You will still have that original face, that Blender geometry, because Blender works with quads, as we know, and it doesn't easily work to split faces for you like this. So I'm working on a way to automatically add the geometry that you would need. In this case, it would simply be a line, an edge here and an edge here, and then you could move this geometry in and out. You could extrude quite easily. So I'm working on that. It's coming along. It needs quite a bit more work, especially if you're adding geometry next to an additional extra things that you want to cut out, and circles and those kind of things, but that should be in the next release. And finally, this may not be in the next one. It depends how difficult it is to do, but it will be the ability in edit mode to select vertices, edges, etc., and use construction lines operations like moving and rotating with snaps, etc. So I'm aiming to add that either in this upcoming version or the versions after that. Certainly for version 1, that release. So that is all of the features, changes, bug fixes, aims for the next version, etc. And I also just want to say a quick thank you to everyone who has bought the add-on. It's been and given feedback as well. It's been so useful. I've really appreciated that. It's very hard to test your own work or see it objectively, so it's been great getting all that feedback and some great suggestions for future development. That many of those things will come along the line, so thanks for that. And just a quick note to say that this really is the beginning with the add-on. I want to move as much of the functionality that I use professionally from other pieces of software into Blender so that I can work fully in Blender. That's the aim with this. And if this is something that interests you in your own workflow and there are things that you feel are absolutely needed for you, then do let me know, because if it's something that I can add, I will try and add it in. Please keep the comments coming on the forum, and certainly through the website or the Discord server. I'll put a link below if you've not seen that. I do read them. I do try and respond to everything. And I think that is it until the next version. So thank you very much, and I will talk to you all soon. Thank you.